The bar was nearly empty when Silas Monroe, a single father, sat quietly before his half-finished whiskey. In the seat beside him, a powerful woman had been watching him for 10 minutes in silence. Vivian Caldwell leaned closer, her expensive perfume drifting past, then whispered near his ear, "Stay with me tonight." Not a casual invitation, this was the moment that would turn both their identities, pasts, and destinies upside down. The city outside wore its late-year cold like armor, rain streaking windows. The bar where Silas sat wasn't the kind that appeared in tourist guides. It was a corner establishment with dim lighting, honest prices, and bartenders who knew when to leave a man alone. Silas came here 3 times a month, always when Ivy was asleep and he needed to turn off his mind for a few minutes. Not to get drunk, he never ordered more than 2 drinks, but to exist in a space where no one needed him, and the weight of being everything to a 7-year-old could rest somewhere else. At 36, Silas Monroe looked weathered by circumstance rather than age. His hands were calloused from electrical work, his shoulders broad from carrying equipment and a child who believed her father could fix anything. He spoke rarely and carried a self-respect that made him refuse favors even when desperate. By day, he worked as an independent electrician. By night, he pulled security shifts, switching schedules around Ivy's school hours like a puzzle, with no perfect solution. His phone sat face up on the bar, volume off but screen bright. He lived in constant awareness that the school might call. In his wallet, Silas kept a photo of Ivy from her 6th birthday and a folded note his wife had written before the accident. The words were carved into memory deeper than ink. Ivy Monroe was small for 7, with dark eyes that noticed everything. She was smart and sensitive in ways that made her pick up on things he tried to hide. She knew they didn't have much money. She knew other kids went on vacations and had birthday parties. She knew her father worked 2 jobs. What broke Silas was the question she'd started asking. "Dad, are you okay?" She'd look up with worried eyes, and he'd force a smile and lie. But children know. At school, Ivy had withdrawn. She didn't ask to join programs because she understood they cost money. A child shouldn't have to think that way. Silas's wife had died 3 years ago in what everyone called an accident, an electrical fire at her workplace, a malfunction during a storm. The official report cited operator error. The company offered a settlement. Silas had wanted to fight, to hire a lawyer, to demand answers, but lawyers cost money he didn't have, and companies had resources to tie cases up for years. So he'd walked away, buried his wife, and learned to live with anger that had nowhere to go. What he didn't know was that the electrical systems that failed had been supplied by a corporation whose name he'd hear again soon. Silas didn't trust wealthy people, not because he envied them, but because, in his experience, people with money looked at people without it as either charity cases or obstacles. He hated being pitied almost as much as he hated being used. And he'd learned, through small humiliations and large disappointments, that when someone powerful offered help, there was usually a price that wouldn't be mentioned until you were already in debt. The glass in front of him was still half full when he noticed her, a woman walking into the bar with the kind of stride that said she didn't belong in places like this, but wasn't going to apologize for being here anyway. She wore a dark coat that probably cost more than Silas's monthly rent, and her hair was pulled back in a style that was professional even at 11 at night. But it was her eyes that caught his attention the way they scanned the room, not with curiosity but with calculation, like someone checking exits in a building they didn't trust. And outside, barely visible through the rain-streaked window, a man with a phone stood near the entrance, angling it toward the door. Vivian Caldwell had been CEO of Caldwell Strategic Group for 2 years. At 34, she was younger than most board members, sharper than all of them, and resented by everyone who'd expected a figurehead they could control. She hadn't slept well in months. The company her grandfather built was now a battlefield, and she was fighting wars on multiple fronts with allies she couldn't trust. The central conflict had a name: Clinton Hayes, a senior executive who'd made clear he viewed her as temporary. Hayes was pushing a merger that would boost stock prices short-term but gut the company's technology division and eliminate hundreds of jobs. The board loved it. Vivian opposed it because she'd read the fine print, but opposition had consequences. Hayes had allies building a case to remove her. If she signed the merger, she'd destroy everything the company stood for. If she refused, they'd vote her out. Her father, Bernard Caldwell, had made his position clear. "You're being stubborn. This isn't about principles, it's about survival." But Vivian hadn't become CEO to survive. She'd taken the position to lead. The problem was that leadership without support looked like rebellion. She'd noticed the surveillance 3 days ago: a car in her rearview mirror, a man with a camera outside her building. Her assistant, Helen Brooks, had shown her photos circulating among board members. Hayes was building a scandal. He didn't have one yet, but he was positioning the pieces. All he needed was the right photograph, and Vivian's credibility would evaporate. So tonight, when she'd spotted the car following her, she'd made a decision. She dismissed her driver, changed routes, and walked into a corner bar where nobody knew her name. She needed to disappear for an hour. She needed to breathe. Then she saw him. A man sitting alone with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen hard things and decided not to talk about them. He didn't look at her like most men did. He glanced up, registered her, and went back to his thoughts. Vivian watched him for 10 minutes, the way he checked his phone without touching it, the way his shoulders carried tension but his hands stayed relaxed. She felt safer near this stranger than she'd felt anywhere in weeks. Then she saw the man outside angle his phone toward the window. The trap had followed her inside. Vivian sat one stool away from Silas. She ordered a drink she wouldn't finish. He didn't react. After a moment, she spoke quietly. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Silas looked at her and nodded once. He didn't ask why. He didn't offer small talk. It was in that silence Vivian made her decision. She couldn't go home with someone waiting to photograph her. She couldn't call security, half of them probably reported to Hayes. She needed a witness with no connection to her world, no reason to lie for or against her. And sitting next to her was a man who looked like he didn't care about much beyond surviving the day. But there was another problem. If Vivian left alone, the story would be that she'd spent the evening drinking, vulnerable, unstable. If she left with anyone, the story would be worse, unless she controlled the narrative first. Silas had noticed the man by the door 10 minutes earlier. Wrong posture, wrong focus. When Vivian walked in, the phone came up. Silas knew surveillance when he saw it. He hadn't planned to get involved. But then he'd seen Vivian's hand tremble, and he'd recognized someone trying very hard not to fall apart in public. He stood, pretended to take a call, and positioned himself to block the camera angle. It was instinct. The same instinct that made him check door locks twice and walk Ivy to school. When he sat back down, Vivian was looking at him. Then she leaned closer and whispered 4 words that made no sense. "Stay with me tonight." Silas turned his head, met her eyes, and saw something that made him pause. Fear. Real fear. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that came from being cornered. He should have said no. He should have finished his drink, wished her luck, and gone home to check on Ivy. But instead, he heard himself ask, "What kind of trouble are you in?" Vivian's laugh was quiet and bitter. The kind where if I leave alone, I'm guilty of something I didn't do. And if I leave with you, I'm guilty of something else. But at least with you, there's a witness who knows the truth. Silas studied her. She wasn't drunk, she wasn't playing games. She was asking for help in the only way someone with pride could ask, by making it sound like a transaction. "I don't know you," Silas said carefully. "I know. That's why I'm asking. He should have walked away. Every instinct told him this was a problem that would get bigger before it got smaller. But then he looked at her hand again, still shaking, and he thought about the kinds of people who had the resources to follow someone with cameras, and he made a decision that he'd question 100 times in the coming days. 3 conditions, he said quietly. No games. No lies. And the second I think this is something I can't explain to my daughter, I'm gone. Vivian nodded, and for the first time since she'd walked into the bar, something in her expression softened. Deal. They left through the back exit, Silas walking slightly ahead, checking the alley the way he'd learned to check dark spaces during his security shifts. The man with the phone had moved to the front entrance, waiting. By the time he realized they'd left another way, Vivian and Silas were already in a cab, heading toward a hotel Vivian named that Silas had only seen in photographs. The Meridian Hotel occupied 12 floors of pristine glass and marble in the financial district, the kind of place where doormen wore white gloves and the lobby smelled like lilies and wealth. Silas stepped through the entrance and felt every eye track him. The worn work jacket, the scuffed boots, the posture of a man who didn't belong. Vivian walked to the desk with the easy confidence of someone who'd stayed in places like this her entire life. She booked 2 rooms, side by side, and handed Silas a key card without explanation. The clerk's expression never changed, but Silas saw the judgment anyway. In the elevator, Vivian finally spoke. I'm not trying to put you in an uncomfortable position. I just need tonight to not become a story I can't control. Silas looked at her reflection in the polished doors. Who's following you? People who want my job. People who think I'm easier to remove than convince. And you thought a guy from a dive bar was going to help with that? I thought a guy from a dive bar wouldn't have a reason to lie about what did or didn't happen tonight. The rooms were side by side on the 8th floor, connected by an interior door that Vivian unlocked from her side. She left it open, but didn't cross the threshold. Silas set his jacket on the chair and stood near the window, looking out at a city that looked different from this height cleaner, more organized, like poverty was something that only existed in neighborhoods you couldn't see from here. You have a family, Vivian said. It wasn't a question. A daughter. Ivy. She's 7. Is her mother? Gone. The word sat between them, heavy and final. Vivian didn't push. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, her CEO composure cracking just enough to show the exhaustion underneath. I'm being forced to sign away something that will hurt a lot of people, she said quietly. And if I don't sign, I'll be removed and someone worse will take my place. Either way, I lose. Silas turned from the window. What are you most afraid of? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. Being turned into a joke. Being remembered as the CEO who couldn't handle the pressure, and not having anyone believe me when I try to tell the truth. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in months. They talked until past 2 in the morning, not about business or strategy, but about the specific weight of being responsible for other people's futures. Vivian told him about the merger, about Hayes, about her father's disappointment. Silas told her about Ivy, about the school forms he couldn't afford to sign, about the particular helplessness of being a parent who couldn't give his child the childhood she deserved. At one point, Vivian's breathing changed short, rapid, panicked. A panic attack, Silas realized. He'd seen them before, on job sites, after accidents, in people who'd held things together until they couldn't anymore. He didn't touch her. He opened the window, brought her water, and talked in the same calm voice he used when Ivy woke from nightmares. Breathe in for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. It took 10 minutes before Vivian's breathing steadied. When she looked up, her eyes were red but clear. Thank you, she whispered. Silas just nodded. At 2:30, he went to his own room and lay on top of the covers, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about calling the sitter to check on Ivy but didn't want to wake her. He thought about what he'd say if anyone asked where he'd been tonight, and he thought about the look in Vivian's eyes when she'd asked him to stay, the look of someone who'd run out of people to trust. At 7 in the morning, Silas left the hotel the same way he'd entered, through the front doors, visible to the cameras, alone. He took the subway back to his neighborhood, picked up Ivy from the sitter, and tried to return to his regular life. He thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The construction site where Silas had been scheduled to work was in the financial district, a new office complex going up where an old warehouse used to stand. He arrived at 7:30, lunch packed, tools ready. The crew was already setting up when he noticed the line of black cars pulling up to the site trailer. Then he saw her. Vivian stepped out of the lead vehicle, surrounded by assistants and security, her expression composed and distant, the face of someone who'd put her armor back on. She was here for an inspection, Silas realized. This was her project, her company. Their eyes met across 50 feet of construction site. Silas saw the flicker of recognition, saw her expression tighten, and then watched as she deliberately looked away. It landed like a slap. He understood the logic. She couldn't acknowledge him here, not in front of her team, not with whatever story she was trying to control. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. For a few hours last night, they'd been two people helping each other survive. Now, in daylight, they were back to being what they'd always been, a CEO and a day laborer, separated by a gap too wide to cross. Silas put his head down and went back to work. By noon, the photos were already circulating. Someone had captured images of Vivian entering the Meridian Hotel late at night. Someone had edited them, cropped them, chosen the angles that made the story they wanted. By the time the first tabloid site posted them, the narrative was already written. CEO's late-night mystery, Caldwell spotted entering luxury hotel. The photos didn't show Silas. They didn't need to. The suggestion was enough. At 1 o'clock, Otis Grant, the site supervisor, called Silas into the trailer. Grant was a man in his 50s who'd spent 30 years in construction and had the kind of face that revealed nothing. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Monroe, you're off the job." Silas blinked. "What?" "You were late twice last week." "Safety violation. I was 3 minutes late one day because the subway broke down. And I've never had a safety violation." Grant pulled out a form, already filled out, and slid it across the desk. "Your services are no longer required." Silas looked at the paper, then at Grant, and understood. This wasn't about tardiness or safety. This was about being too close to the wrong person. "Someone told you to fire me." Grant's expression didn't change. Silas walked off the site at 1:30 with his tools, his dignity, and no job. By the time he picked up Ivy from school, the story had spread further. Parents who'd always been polite suddenly found reasons to look away. One mother, someone Silas had chatted with at pickup for 2 years, pulled her son away when Ivy approached. That night, Ivy came home quiet. At dinner, she pushed her food around her plate without eating. Finally, she looked up. "Dad, did you do something bad?" The question broke something in Silas's chest. Then why is everyone saying things? He didn't have an answer that a 7-year-old would understand. So he told her the only truth that mattered. Sometimes people say things that aren't true because it makes them feel powerful. But the truth doesn't change just because someone lies about it. Ivy nodded, but her eyes stayed worried. Vivian was suspended from her CEO duties that same afternoon. The board called an emergency meeting, citing concerns about judgment and public image. Clinton Hayes, looking appropriately somber, suggested that Vivian take a leave of absence to focus on personal matters. The vote was 8-3. Bernard Caldwell called her that evening. The conversation was brief and brutal. "You've given them everything they needed. I can't protect you from your own choices." Vivian wanted to scream that she hadn't done anything wrong, that the whole thing was a setup, that Hayes had orchestrated this from the beginning. But her father had already made up his mind. To him, the details didn't matter. The scandal did. She sat alone in her penthouse that night, looking at the city below, and realized that every ally she'd thought she had was gone. Her executive team had stayed silent during the meeting. Her father had chosen the company's reputation over her. Even Helen, who'd been loyal for years, had been reassigned to another department. She'd never felt more alone in her life. Silas and Vivian were each living in their own version of hell, separated by circumstance and connected by a disaster neither had wanted. Silas couldn't reach out, he had no way to contact her. And even if he did, what would he say? Vivian couldn't reach out either. Anything she did now would only make things worse for both of them. So they suffered separately, each carrying the weight of a story that wasn't true but felt impossible to fight. For Silas, the worst part wasn't losing the job. It was watching Ivy withdraw further into herself, becoming quieter, smaller, like she was trying to take up less space in a world that had decided her father was someone to avoid. For Vivian, the worst part wasn't the suspension. It was sitting in her empty apartment, realizing that every relationship she'd built had been conditional on her maintaining power. And now that the power was gone, so was everyone else. 3 days after the suspension, Helen Brooks appeared at Vivian's door with a flash drive and a warning. "I could lose my job for this," Helen said, handing over the drive. "But you deserve to know what you're fighting." The files on the drive were devastating. Internal emails showing Hayes coordinating with board members months before the hotel incident. Financial records showing suspicious transactions. And buried deep in archived project files, a name that made Vivian's blood run cold. Silas Monroe. He'd been part of an engineering project 8 years ago, something involving electrical safety systems for industrial facilities. The project had been promising innovative, potentially game-changing, and then it had been quietly shut down. The intellectual property transferred to a subsidiary that Hayes had ties to, and the engineers who developed it paid off or pushed out. Silas's name was on half the original patents. But the final filings listed someone else as the inventor. Vivian stared at the screen, her mind racing. This wasn't just about the merger. This was about a pattern. Hayes had been stealing ideas and burying the people who created them for years. And somehow, impossibly, the man she'd met in a bar had been one of his victims long before they'd ever crossed paths. Silas received a package 2 days later from a lawyer he'd consulted years ago and had almost forgotten about. Inside was a report on the electrical fire that had killed his wife, compiled from sources the lawyer had finally managed to access through a Freedom of Information request. The report was clinical and thorough. It detailed equipment failures, missed inspections, and safety protocols that had been waived to meet construction deadlines. And at the bottom of the supply chain, providing the backup power systems that had failed, was a company Silas had never heard of. He looked up the company. It took 3 clicks to trace it back to its parent corporation, Caldwell Strategic Group. Silas sat at his kitchen table, holding the report, feeling the world shift beneath him. The woman he'd helped, the woman he'd started to trust, despite every instinct telling him not to, was the CEO of the company responsible for his wife's death. The fury that rose in him was cold and sharp. He wanted to call her, to demand an explanation, to make her feel even a fraction of what he'd lost. But he also knew that she likely hadn't known, hadn't been CEO at the time, hadn't made the decisions that led to that night. But she carried the name. She held the power. And that made her complicit in his mind, whether it was fair or not. When Vivian finally reached out, it was through a carefully worded message delivered by Helen. She wanted to meet. She had information. She knew Silas had no reason to trust her, but she was asking anyway. They met in a park, in daylight, in public. Vivian looked different than she had at the hotel. No makeup, no armor, just exhaustion and determination. "I know what happened to your wife," she said before Silas could speak. "I know the equipment came from a company we owned. I know there were violations that got buried, and I know I can't give you back what you lost, but I can give you the truth." Silas's jaw tightened. "Why would I believe anything you say? Because I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to help me prove it. Hayes has been covering up safety violations and intellectual property theft for years. Your project was one of them. My company's negligence killed your wife, and if we don't stop him now, he's going to do it again. I don't care about your company politics. This isn't politics, this is justice. For your wife, for you, for every person Hayes has buried to protect his deals." Silas looked at her, seeing past the CEO title to the woman who'd sat beside him in a bar and whispered for help. "What are you asking? Help me bring him down. Help me expose everything, and I'll make sure you get the answers you've been looking for." It was a devil's bargain. But Silas had learned long ago that justice didn't arrive on its own. Sometimes you had to reach into the darkness and drag it out yourself. "One condition," he said. "When this is over, you open every file related to that fire. Every email, every report, every decision. No redactions, no corporate protection. Everything." Vivian met his eyes and nodded. Everything. The plan came together over the next week in careful, deliberate steps. Helen provided the paper trail emails, financial records, testimony from employees who'd been afraid to speak before. Silas provided the technical analysis that proved the safety systems had been compromised deliberately to cut costs. Together, they built a case that was impossible to ignore, but evidence only mattered if it reached the right audience. Hayes controlled the board, had allies in the media, and had proven he could spin any narrative to his advantage. They needed a moment he couldn't control, a confrontation he couldn't avoid. Vivian proposed a meeting under false pretenses. She sent word through Bernard that she was ready to sign the merger agreement if they'd reinstate her position for the transition. It was exactly what Hayes wanted to hear, surrender dressed up as negotiation. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Vivian walked into that conference room like she was walking to an execution, but her hands were steady. Clinton Hayes sat at the head of the table, already occupying the space he'd coveted for years. The board members arranged themselves with careful neutrality, unwilling to back Vivian but curious about her sudden capitulation. "I appreciate the board reconsidering," Vivian began, her voice measured and professional. "I've given a lot of thought to the merger proposal and to my role in this company." Hayes smiled. "We all want what's best for Caldwell Strategic. Do you?" Vivian opened her laptop, and Helen mirrored the display to the room's screen. "Because I've been reviewing our history, and I've found some interesting patterns." The first document appeared in email from Hayes to a subsidiary manager, instructing them to transfer intellectual property rights from an engineer named Silas Monroe without compensation. This engineer developed safety systems that could have prevented multiple industrial accidents. You buried his work to avoid testing costs. The next screen showed financial transfers, shell companies, kickbacks hidden in consulting fees. You've been siphoning resources from safety initiatives to fund personal investments for years. Hayes's smile faded. "This is absurd. Where did you even get—" "From your own servers, from emails you thought were deleted, from employees who were finally willing to talk." The room had gone completely silent. Board members who'd been checking phones were now paying attention. Vivian pulled up the final document, the incident report from the fire that killed Silas's wife, annotated with evidence of ignored safety violations and Hayes's direct orders to expedite the project despite warnings. "And this," Vivian said, her voice harder now, "is what happens when cutting corners becomes policy." A woman died because you decided her life was worth less than your timeline. You can't prove any connection. The conference room door opened. Silas Monroe walked in, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, but carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd earned the right to speak. "I can," Silas said. He set a folder on the table, thick with technical documentation, legal analysis, and evidence that had taken years to compile. "My name is Silas Monroe. 8 years ago, I developed electrical safety systems that your company stole. 3 years ago, my wife died in a fire caused by equipment your company provided. And last month, you had me fired from a construction site because I was inconvenient to your narrative." He looked directly at Hayes. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because you need to be stopped before someone else's family gets destroyed." Bernard Caldwell, who'd been silent throughout, finally spoke. "Is this true, Clinton?" Hayes tried to deflect, tried to claim the documents were fabricated, tried to turn the focus back to Vivian's instability, but the evidence was too solid, too well documented, and too damning. Helen stepped forward with statements from 3 other employees who'd been pressured into silence, each corroborating the pattern of safety violations and intellectual property theft. The vote to remove Clinton Hayes was unanimous. The vote to reinstate Vivian and launch a full internal investigation was 11-1, with Bernard abstaining, unable to support his daughter publicly but unwilling to vote against her anymore. As the meeting adjourned, Bernard approached Silas. The older man looked diminished, his corporate armor cracked by the weight of knowing his company had caused such harm. "I can't give you back what you lost," Bernard said quietly. "But I can make sure it meant something." Silas just nodded. Some debts couldn't be repaid with words. 6 months later, Silas Monroe opened a small engineering firm, specializing in safety systems for industrial facilities. The funding came partially from a settlement with Caldwell Strategic, not charity, but compensation for stolen intellectual property, and a contractual agreement to consult on all future safety implementations. It wasn't wealth, it was justice, converted into sustainable income. Ivy had her own room now, in an apartment with heat that worked and windows that didn't leak. She'd rejoined her school activities, her smile coming back gradually like sun after a long winter. She still asked if her dad was okay sometimes, but now when he said yes, she believed him. Vivian remained CEO, but she'd changed the company's approach fundamentally. She established a victims fund for families affected by safety negligence. She implemented transparent reporting systems. She fired every executive who'd been complicit in Hayes's schemes and rebuilt her team with people who valued integrity over profit margins. Bernard Caldwell never fully apologized, but he showed up at Ivy's 8th birthday party with a gift and a quiet acknowledgement to Silas that some mistakes couldn't be fixed, only learned from. On a Thursday evening, 6 months and 12 days after that night in the bar, Vivian knocked on Silas's door. She wasn't wearing CEO armor. She was wearing jeans and holding takeout from a place that didn't make reservations weeks in advance. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, which was obviously a lie since she lived 40 minutes away. Silas smiled and opened the door wider. "Ivy's doing homework. She'll be excited to see you." They ate dinner together, Silas, Vivian, and Ivy talking about school projects and engineering contracts, and nothing particularly important. It was comfortable. Normal. The kind of evening that didn't require explanations or pretense. After Ivy went to bed, Silas and Vivian sat on the small balcony, looking out at a city that seemed less hostile than it had months ago. "I keep thinking about that night," Vivian said. "What you said about your daughter, that you'd leave if you couldn't explain it to her. I meant it. I know. That's why I trusted you." They were quiet for a moment. Then Vivian spoke again, softer this time. "I said, stay with me tonight, because I was afraid and needed a witness. If I asked you to stay now, not because I'm scared, but because this feels like home, would that be different?" Silas looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who'd learned the difference between power and strength, between controlling a narrative and living an honest life. "Yeah," he said, "that would be different." Ivy appeared in the doorway, sleepy and holding her stuffed rabbit. "Dad, I can't sleep. Can Vivian tell me a story?" Vivian looked at Silas, asking permission without words. He nodded. As Vivian led Ivy back to bed, Silas heard his daughter's voice drifting down the hallway. "Are you going to stay? I like it when you stay." And Vivian's response, warm and certain. "If your dad says it's okay, I'd really like that." The strongest people aren't the ones who stand at the top untouched. They're the ones who've fallen, who've lost, who've been broken by systems that were never built to protect them, and who chose to stand back up not for revenge, but for the chance to build something better. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to fight the same fight alone. And sometimes, in the space between loss and healing, you find the kind of family you didn't know you were allowed to hope for.